I'm tired of this idea that Israel is somehow controlled or influenced by U.S. decision makers. Ever since before I moved to Israel, I felt that any conversation about Netanyahu immediately becomes polarized. I just don't understand a human, especially on October 7th itself, who can find a way to blame Israel for this. And some of you think that you can convince Jews that we're overreacting? You want to gaslight the Jewish community into thinking that this is normal? Welcome back to another episode of Off the Record, where we're trying to bring back nuance, context, and deep dive into some of the most pressing issues facing Israel and the region today. I'm Zina Rakhamilova, and my goal here is for us to have the difficult conversations that have become impossible to have today. We want this to be a space where we can actually listen, think critically, and get to the stories behind the headlines. And speaking of headlines, there's one story in particular that has captured the nation's attention this week. On Sunday, November 30th, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu formally asked President Isaac Herzog to pardon him in his years-long corruption trial. Very few people in Israel today are as controversial or as polarizing as Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu. He is Israel's longest ever serving prime minister, and he is admired by many as a strategic statesman who has strengthened Israel's global standing. Then there are those who criticize him fiercely for deepening internal divisions, undermining democratic norms, and prioritizing his political survival over national cohesion. His long time in office, the ongoing corruption trial, and the major political fights of recent years, including the judicial overhaul, have made him a leader who is either seen as indispensable or as a central source for Israel's political turmoil. Now, in 2019, Netanyahu was indicted on charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust, and he has pleaded not guilty to all of the charges. The Israeli Basic Law says that the president of Israel holds the authority to pardon offenders or reduce their sentences, similarly to how it's done in the U.S. There could easily be an entire episode dedicated to unpacking the allegations against Netanyahu, and plenty of journalists have already done a far better job explaining them than I ever could. So if you're really curious, I encourage you all to deep dive because there's a lot. But it's been 6 years of Bibi and his trial and the headlines, and it seems that it's set to go on for another 6 years. Now, fast forward to several weeks ago, on November 12th to be exact, U.S. President Donald Trump formally requested that Herzog fully pardon the Israeli Prime Minister. This is a copy of the letter, and it says here, "While I absolutely respect the independence of the Israeli justice system and its requirements, I believe that in this case against Bibi, who has fought alongside me for a long time, including against the very tough adversary of Israel, Iran, is a political unjustified prosecution." Now, what I want to say is that whatever your thoughts are on Netanyahu or the trial and the charges, to me, this move by Trump, though probably welcomed if you're a Bibi supporter, raises serious concerns. Allowing a foreign leader, even the U.S. president, to weigh in on Israel's legal proceedings undermines our sovereignty and the independence of our institutions. While I appreciate what Trump has done regarding the war against Hamas, I'm tired of this idea that Israel is somehow controlled or influenced by U.S. decision makers on all of our internal matters, not just how we prosecute a politician. It makes it seem that our decisions are controlled by external pressure, which both weakens the public trust and weakens Israel's standing as a self-governing democracy. And this also bothered me during the Biden administration, where Israel appeared to be at the mercy of the U.S. when it came to major wartime decisions, like going into Rafah, which, by the way, we delayed going into because of U.S. pressure. And while there's a clear difference between how Trump is handling this war versus Biden, any administration appearing that they can dictate our internal affairs or how we conduct a war makes us look weak. And in a post-October 7th world, it's never been more important for us to restore our strength and deterrence. Now, Going back to Netanyahu's pardon request, there are two documents that were sent to President Herzog, which included both a 11-page letter written by his lawyer, Amit Haddad, and a personal letter from Bibi himself to the president. In the letter, Netanyahu is not apologizing, he is not admitting to guilt, nor is he offering to resign in exchange for a pardon. But his lawyer makes the argument that granting this pardon will allow the prime minister to devote all of his time and energy to advancing Israel's interests during these critical times. Haddad also states that in the coming months, extraordinary developments are expected in the Middle East, and he also warns that Israel has to be ready for our enemies and their attempts at rehabilitating themselves. So this entire argument for Bibi's pardon is that it's getting in the way of him doing his job as the prime minister. And this raises an interesting point because after his indictment, critics say that Netanyahu claimed he would have no trouble being the prime minister while facing trial. The court requires that he testify 3 times a week. Now, something else that's striking about all this is that in the official pardon request to Herzog, in line number 10, it says the following. We're translating this from Hebrew. Granting a pardon would allow the prime minister to work towards healing the rift within the nation and to address other issues, such as matters related to the judicial system and the media. These are issues he is currently barred from dealing with because of the ongoing trial against him. This is obviously referring to the judicial overhaul that spurred nationwide protests over the prospect of weakening the power of Israel's Supreme Court. It is these protests that many argue made Israel look weak and divided in the eyes of Hamas, who interpreted it as an opportunity to carry out the October 7th massacre. Now, we know Hamas spent 5 years planning October 7th, so the argument isn't that the protests against the judicial overhaul is what caused the massacre, but instead it contributed to a perception of internal division and vulnerability, an impression that Hamas may have seen as an opportunity, although they completely misjudged Israelis in thinking that the moment we were attacked that we would do anything else besides rally and defend our nation, no matter what internal divisions we had. Now, some will criticize the protesters for shaping Hamas's perceptions, and others criticize Netanyahu's government for pushing a judicial overhaul despite the fact that a significant portion of the country was opposed to it. But the second issue in the pardon request is the government's controversial media bill, which would make major changes to how Israel and the media works. The bill would shut down the current systems that oversee TV, radio, and online news and replace them with a new council. Most of the people on this new council would be picked by the communications minister, meaning that the government would gain much more influence over what happens in the media. Supporters of this bill say that it will update an old system and finally bring real competition to a media world that is currently dominated by a few major channels in Israel. And critics worry that the changes would give politicians too much control over the news, weaken freedom of the press, and possibly reduce independent journalism even further. Now, the reason I'm deep diving into all of this is because these have been major issues in Israel for so many years. And what this pardon request from Netanyahu's lawyer is implying is that if Netanyahu is granted a pardon, then these two issues can pretty much go away. So, what does Isaac Herzog have to say? The official response says, after receiving all the relevant options, the president will responsibly and sincerely consider the request. Herzog's decision can take weeks, and this puts Israel's president in a difficult position. Netanyahu isn't offering anything in exchange for a pardon, not retirement, not an admission of guilt, and while Herzog could grant him the pardon, he would most certainly do it on his own terms. He would probably demand an admission of guilt, maybe impose term limits, or require that Netanyahu step down by a specific date, or perhaps by the next presidential election. And honestly, ever since before I moved to Israel, I felt that any conversation about Netanyahu immediately becomes polarized. You're either talking to people with Netanyahu derangement syndrome or to these diehard Bibi loyalists called Bibistim. It's exhausting. Everything in our politics seems to revolve around whether you love or hate Bibi. Israelis are tired of it. Many of us feel that people who are obsessed with this endless Bibi versus anti-Bibi fight, the politicians, judges, and public figures, have made life here harder and even contributed to the security failures that we all live through. It feels like these leaders are prioritizing their battles over our actual needs, our security, our economy, and our day-to-day lives. So I genuinely don't care what the right decision is. I believe in Israel's strong judicial system, but I also can't take this nonstop Bibi drama anymore. I think most of us are simply over it. Whatever brings this saga to an end, whether he's found guilty or not, we just want to move forward with a government that prioritizes our future, our success, and our security. And speaking of leadership and the challenges that come with it, let's leave Jerusalem for a moment and jump all the way across the Atlantic to New York City. Obviously, the biggest talk right now in New York is new Mayor-elect Zohran Mamdani, who has been quite a hard pill to swallow for many Jewish New Yorkers about what the future of Jewish life will look like. Since the beginning of his campaign, Mamdani has faced ongoing accusations of anti-Semitism from different Jewish organizations, political opponents, and public figures. Let's go through some of them. Mamdani is a vocal supporter of the BDS movement, so he's actively hoping to sever any academic relationships between New York and Israeli universities and institutions. While he was a student at Bowdoin College, he co-founded the school's Students for Justice in Palestine chapter. To this day, Mamdani misrepresents Israel's war against Hamas and their goal of bringing the hostages home who were held in inhumane conditions in the dungeons of Gaza. While he did condemn Hamas's October 7th attacks, he was asked in detail about the role Hamas should play in the future of Gaza on Fox News. Let's take a look at his response.
Do you believe that Hamas should lay down their weapons and leave the leadership in Gaza?
I believe that any future here in New York City is one that we have to make sure that's affordable for all. And as it pertains to Israel and Palestine, that we have to ensure that there is peace. And that is the future that we have to fight for.
But you won't say that Hamas should lay down their arms and give up leadership in Gaza.
I don't really have opinions about the future of Hamas and Israel beyond the question of justice and safety and the fact that anything has to abide by international law. And that applies to Hamas, that applies to the Israeli military, applies to anyone you could ask me about.
Why is it so hard to say, yes, a terror organization should disarm, the same terror group that killed 30 Palestinians right after the ceasefire began should maybe not have a governing role in Gaza? Now, Mamdani has also stated that he doesn't support Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, stating that he wouldn't recognize any state's right to exist with a system of hierarchy on the basis of race or religion, another misrepresentation of the reality here in Israel. During his campaign, Mamdani did condemn anti-Semitism multiple times and stated that he wants to work to combat hate crimes across New York City. It seems, however, that it's only the expressions of anti-Semitism that don't get in the way of his politics or his views. Now, one of the biggest talking points used against those trying to whitewash Mamdani's anti-Semitism is using the fact that a significant portion of Jewish New Yorkers voted for him. They'll claim that he cannot possibly be an anti-Semite when 30% of Jewish New Yorkers supported Mamdani, and all the allegations against him are simply over his Israel stance. And I wanted to address that because I'm hearing all of these numbers being thrown around. We have this one CNN exit poll that found that 31% of Jewish New Yorkers supported Mamdani, while 65% voted for independent candidate Andrew Cuomo, and 3% backed Republican Curtis Sliwa. The poll was based on a Jewish sample of roughly 710 respondents, but something to note is that New York doesn't release data on voters' religion or ethnicity, and CNN didn't disclose the poll's margin of error or the full methodology. Then there was the Quinnipiac University poll released on October 29th, which found that only 16% of Jews supported Mamdani, and it also showed that 75% of Jews held an unfavorable view towards him. I personally don't know what the real number is because these exit polling numbers don't make any sense. But sampling 710 Jews in a city where they make up 12% of the population, I'd be highly skeptical of these numbers. Now, I'm not from New York, and so while I have my views and I was following the mayoral election very closely, it was important for me not to speak over Jewish New Yorkers who now have to live with a mayor who cannot condemn phrases like globalize the Intifada, claiming that his role isn't to police language, or who cannot properly call out a violent mob outside of a synagogue and labels it as a violation of international law simply because Nefesh B'Nefesh was the one hosting the event. But when I found out some of the people who will now be on Mamdani's transition team, it struck a nerve. Among the 400 people appointed to his administration, it includes prominent members of the Democratic Socialists of America, lawyers, retired police officers, and activists, and to nobody's surprise, many of them are known for their anti-Israel stance and their alleged history of anti-Semitism. Let's take a short look at who is on this list. First, we've got Walid Shahid, who will be serving on Mamdani's Committee on Community Organizing. On October 7th, when Israelis were still being slaughtered in cold blood, Walid wrote on his Twitter, "Hamas targeting Israeli civilians with violence is horrifying and unacceptable. Similar to the violent militias in Ireland, South Africa, and many places around the world, Hamas is also a byproduct of Israel's violent policies of occupation and second-class status of Palestinians." I just don't understand a human, especially on October 7th itself, who can find a way to blame Israel for this. How on earth do you watch the barbaric footage of women, young men, children, babies, and the elderly being slaughtered and kidnapped by armed terrorists, or watching the dead bodies of people being paraded on the streets of Gaza by these monsters while the crowd of civilians were cheering, and find some way to blame it on Israel? It says a lot about who you are as a human. Next, we have Jenna Hamad, who will serve on the Committee on Arts and Culture. Jenna Hamad is a Palestinian-American curator and bookmaker. On October 13th, 2023, she posted, "I will commend, support, reaffirm my people for all measures taken towards life and liberation. If you believe in a free Palestine, you believe in a free Gaza. When you say free Palestine, it means you support the obliteration of all borders." This is referencing how Hamas broke through the barrier with Israel, invaded it, and then went on their slaughter rampage. It also implies that she doesn't believe in any borders with Israel, meaning she would be happy with the eradication of Israel. There are several problematic people on this list, but one that really got me furious was Tamika Mallory, a name that I haven't heard in years. For those who don't know, Mallory was one of the former leaders of the Women's March, alongside Linda Sarsour, also a Mamdani supporter, Carmen Perez, and Bob Bland. Now, Tamika Mallory in particular stepped down from the board of the Women's March in 2019 amid allegations of anti-Semitism. Specifically, Mallory had glorified the anti-Semitic Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan and refused to condemn his discrimination against Jews. She also reportedly said that Jews were responsible for the oppression of people of color. I'll never forget the interview that she had on The View where she was called out and she was unable to condemn Farrakhan's anti-Semitic statements and couldn't even address her own anti-Semitism. Let's take a watch.
Well, there has been some controversy surrounding the Women's March organization. And Tamika, you came under some fire for your relationship with Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam. Now, he's known for being anti-Semitic.
The satanic Jews, they control everything and mostly everybody. If they are your enemy, then you must
But you do attend his events, and you posted, I believe, a photo together calling him the GOAT, which means the greatest of all time.
And, and just because you go into a space with someone does not mean that you agree with everything that they say.
But let me push back a little bit. Why call him the greatest of all time?
I didn't call him the greatest of all time because of his rhetoric. I called him the greatest of all time because of what he's done in black communities. And I think that,
Let me just interject really quickly. I would never be comfortable supporting someone who called, I'm not anti-Semite and I'm anti-termite. It's the wicked Jews, the false Jews that are promoting lesbianism, homosexuality. I actually spoke with the journalist from Tablet magazine who released an investigation report on your organization. And in part, they alleged that there is a lot of anti-Semitism surrounding this march. Specifically, the report alleged that you, Tamika, and co-founder Carmen Perez asserted that, quote, Jewish people had a history of exploiting black people and were proven to be leaders of the American slave trade.
This is who Mamdani appointed to his Committee on Community Safety. And some of you think that you can convince Jews that we're overreacting? You want to gaslight the Jewish community into thinking that this is normal? Tamika Mallory couldn't even respond to this. If you, Mamdani, are appointing someone with this record to a community safety committee, then stop pretending like you care about Jews. Also, Meghan McCain is an absolute queen in how she called her out. So no, I don't think pogroms are going to start tomorrow or anything, but the concerns of the Jewish New Yorkers cannot be ignored or minimized. We cannot allow silence in the face of anti-Semitism to become the norm, and we must continue to speak out. And on that note, that's a wrap for our second episode of Off the Record. I'm Zina Rakhamilova. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for joining me in tackling the conversations that matter, even when they're difficult. See you next week.